Retro Quickies. Action 52. I hope y'all are ready for a real hot take here. You guys won't see this coming a million miles away. This take's so hot you'll need oven mitts to handle it. You ready? Okay, here it is. I don't think this game is very good. Yeah, I don't think I'm surprising anyone when I say that a multi-cart sold for $200, made for the express purpose of being a semi-legal alternative to pirate multi-carts, and primarily programmed by a small group of fresh-out-of-college programmers who probably had like a day to grind out the art, music, and logic for 52 individual games, is bad. Action 52 isn't even the only example of a well-known unlicensed multi-cart, but it's probably the most infamous one, with most of its games falling into the category of shooters of some flavor, with a smattering of platformers, one or two horrible beat-em-ups, and at least one awful puzzle game. Out of all 52 of these games, there are 0 enjoyable experiences. At best, the games are functional but incredibly boring, and at worst, they are so broken you can't even make any sort of progress. Every game controls horribly too, with the biggest standouts being any game that requires you to jump, as all of them use the B button to jump, and if you hold the jump button down for any length of time, you have no horizontal movement in either direction, even when it's just a tap. Your jumps more often than not are entirely gimped, making even the most basic of jumps almost impossible to properly make. But this was also where I discovered this game doesn't work well with the turbo controller, and it kind of breaks everything. Turbo buttons are actually most useful during the platformers because by holding it down, it actually lets you jump as normal, though the action is slow and jittery, almost like you're pause buffering, but it does actually let you get across most gaps. During the shooter games though, holy crap, it causes all kinds of issues. There are several that are programmed not to allow more than one shot on the screen at once, so those ones are fine, but on ones where you can fire more than one shot, when you can create just a stream of bullets, I've had the game glitch out or crash on me due to using turbo controls, but more often than not, the end result was something like this, where I just kept firing a stream of bullets, and the game decided, okay, I guess we're not spawning any enemies today. It was really bizarre. Then there are the handful of games where it basically makes it impossible to lose, like this game where holding down the turbo button makes it nearly impossible for any of the enemies to even approach you. That's right, it turned me into a frickin' JoJo character. Of course, none of the games look appealing, either, with no care to design or contrast, which makes many of them visible eyesores, but even worse is the fact that most of them just look incredibly generic with no real standout personality, with the only game given any sort of care in this department being the Cheetah Men, a series that they wanted to somehow compete with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Yeah, good luck with that when it's competing with 51 other terrible games, and also reuses assets from all the other games as well, with the only real original assets in the game being the character and boss sprites. The music isn't much better, as most of the games use really short, basic loops, and even when you do come across a slightly catchier one, chances are good you'll be hearing it repeat so much that you'll get sick of it pretty quick. Hell, just the fact that you always start on the 5th game instead of the 1st every time you go back to the main menu sets me off for some reason, and it's just a time-wasting hassle to have to scroll back from the start of the list to get back to where I was, rather than having it appear where I left when I exited the game. I will give it credit for that, giving you an option to exit out of a game with the start and select buttons, because if I had to reset the game every time and listen to that unskippable, highly compressed opening to It Takes Two every time, I might just flip my lid. That one piece of digitized voiceover does at least sound appealing.
Make your selection now.
I don't really want to, but sure, I'll do it for you, dude. You need the work, obviously. Now, while most of these games do share similar issues, every game is bad in its own special way, at least most of the time. But I don't have the runtime or the energy to tackle all 52 at once in a single video. That kinda defeats the point of these being quickies. However, we're not done with this yet. So buckle up, Chucklenut, because I'll be taking a look at each of the specific games in groups of 5 in subsequent videos. Not all at once, because I kinda want to keep my sanity, and playing this game at all just puts me in a bad mood. So be sure to look forward to that, and in the meantime, thank you all for taking the time to enjoy this incredibly redundant video. I really appreciate it. But I don't appreciate the fact that I still went out of my way to play Action 52 in the year of our Lord 2024. God, I'm either bored or stupid, and I'm pretty sure I flip-flop between the two. Retro Quickies. Action 52 games 1 through 5. Well, guess I can't keep putting this off forever. Gotta start it sooner rather than later, or it's just gonna end up in the backlog with every other project I try to start and then not finish. So let's get started. This is Action 52, starting with the first 5 games on the cartridge. Fire breathers! You know, I gotta give them credit. It was really bold of them to make the very first game on this horrible cartridge the one and only multiplayer game. Yes, every game on this cart has an option for 2 players, but it's that fake kind of multiplayer where you and your friend have to trade off playing whenever one of you loses a life. This is the only game on the cartridge where 2 players play simultaneously, and it's basically just a clone of Atari's Combat. You play as a dragon who moves around a little forest area, faced with an opponent who won't move because you have no one else to play with, and then you use fireballs on them with a horrible screeching sound until their health drains and you win. First to 5 victories wins overall, and then the game loops back to the beginning. At the very least, this is a game where I can tell what everything is supposed to be, a rarity for this collection, and believe it or not, this game actually works as intended. It's just not that fun or interesting to begin with, and unlike almost every other game in the collection, there's not even any background music. It falls squarely into the boring but playable category, and much like its status as a multiplayer game, it's gonna get real lonely with that distinction.
Star Evil.
Evil is right. The only thing that anyone knows about this game is the fact that it will kill you immediately as soon as you hit start, with a wall placed right in front of you if you aren't immediately holding left. Once you know that and actually get past it though, you're in for a real bad time. It's a scrolling vertical shooter with barely anything to shoot, a problem that only gets worse if you try to be cute and use a turbo button, because that stops literally anything from spawning, including the boss of the level. It's also a horribly designed level, as you die if you touch the edge of the area, and enemies and bosses can slide through these obstacles no problem. And get this, I actually went out of my way to beat the first boss and see what happens in level 2, and apart from a change in color, it is literally the exact same thing, right down to an obstacle that'll kill you right at the level as it starts. The game at least has music, but I think I'd prefer the silence of fire breathers over this bop. This game is a lot more indicative of the level of quality we can expect to see in this collection compared to the first game, and it does not inspire a lot of confidence.
Illuminator.
Boy, I sure do love playing a game where I can't see what I'm doing most of the time. It's a single-screen arcade game where you're throwing what I assumed is just bottles of light juice at infinitely spawning vampires over 4 separate floors. The big gimmick is that every once in a while the lights go out, making it impossible to tell where you or your enemies are, and it comes back when you hit a vampire with the light juice. You only know where you or the enemies are if they happen to walk in front of the various ladders on each floor, but since new enemies can spawn randomly at any point, walking across the level in the dark is very dangerous. The light flickers out real fast too, you don't get a lot of time being able to see what you're doing, and while you can just sit there and keep throwing endlessly, eventually you do have to move to other floors to attack other vampires to actually move on from one level to the next. You're also stopped in your tracks every time you attack, which isn't really that big a deal, but the wasted time does add up as you continue to play, making the game feel tedious at best, rather than tense and dangerous, like you'd want to feel in this situation. At the very least, I'll say the music is a bit better, and I can at least tell what most of the things are supposed to be in terms of the graphics. You know, when I can actually see them.
G-Force Fighters.
A horizontal scrolling shooter where you at least don't have to worry about something killing you at the start of the level. Instead, this one is made insanely easy, either by staying at the very bottom of the playfield where nothing can touch you, or flying up next to the right edge of the screen and holding down the fire button. While the last couple of games have felt frustrating and annoying, this one goes in the opposite direction and makes it far too easy, to the point where it can get real boring real fast. It's as basic a shooter as you can get. The graphics are also super basic, but at least they're not offensive, which is more than I can say for games that are going to be coming up later.
Ooze.
If you know anything about this cartridge, apart from their attempt to turn one of the games into a franchise, it's probably the fact that this particular game was part of a contest where if you beat the last level and submitted a picture of the code that appears afterwards, you could potentially win $104,000. However, it was impossible to do that because the game always crashes after level 2. Always. Not that you'll be getting that far very often, because the game is a horrendous platformer with enemies just scattered haphazardly about, with some enemies that just feel completely unavoidable, not helped by the fact that jumping in any platformer on this cartridge feels horrible, and most of the time it just locks you horizontally, making it impossible to jump over pits. I was able to get past this by abusing the weird way the game treats turbo button inputs to basically spam the jump button as fast as I could to get over the pit. It should also be noted that these games have the jump and attack buttons reversed, so A is your attack button and B is the jump button, which just feels all sorts of wrong. The black void background contrasts well with the sickly green that makes up a majority of the color palette, but because green is such an overused color, it legitimately makes the game boring to look at. Yes, it's frustrating to play, but at the very least other games were a bit more visually interesting, even if they were visual vomit. So, that's 5 games down, and if you haven't noticed, there's not a whole lot to say about each individual game, hence why I'm bundling them together like this. I hope you'll look forward to me tormenting myself by going back to this series occasionally, but for now, I'm done. I need to go and wash all the ooze off my shirt. Retro Quickies, Action 52, Games 6 through 10. Welcome back. You know the drill. We're looking at a bunch of Action 52 games in batches of 5, going through each individual game to give you, the viewer, a better idea of just how bad this cartridge is overall. So let's not waste any time and get right into it.
Silver Sword.
There's not a lot of silver in this game, and I'm convinced that the game is only 1 level long. Why do I say that? Well, no matter how many enemies I killed or how far I managed to travel, the level never seemed to end, so I can't even say if this game has any sense of progression to it. It's a top-down vertical shooting game that isn't an auto-scroller. Boy, that one's quite a curveball, isn't it? Instead of swinging the sword, you throw it at your enemies, and unfortunately a turbo button doesn't help much here, as you can only have one projectile on the screen at a time, so if you miss your shot, you're gonna be waiting a bit before you can shoot again. You do have multiple hits in this game, but how many hits you have is up to you to figure out, since there is no sort of health bar or even an indicator to show that you've taken damage or how close you are to death. The area you're walking through is pretty uninteresting, just a field with a bunch of trees, bushes, and rocks that force you to walk around them occasionally. But it's better than just walking through a black void, I suppose. The enemies, though, are a lot more interesting to look at, mostly because I can't tell what any of them are supposed to be. I'll also give the game credit. This is the first time we've actually seen something resembling enemy behavior rather than just having enemies walk back and forth or just fly across the screen doing nothing. While their movement patterns don't seem to be unique or make any real sense in the grand scheme of things, they're at least acting as a legitimate threat, but they're a little bit too good at that. They move at roughly the same speed that you do, or are faster than you, and they generally don't let you outpace them. They'll continue to follow you as long as they need to, and even when you do manage to pass one by, it's not long before it's replaced. This is probably the most complex game so far, but that's not saying much, and it doesn't really make the game any fun to play when most of the outcomes of any move you make feel completely random, and you don't have a decent way of defending yourself.
Critical bypass.
Okay, so while none of the games up to this point have looked good, this is the first time I feel I need to warn you all before actually showing you footage. This game is legitimately painful to look at, so if you're someone who is prone to eye strain or headaches, maybe don't watch this one full screen. You ready? Okay, good. Let's go. This is another scrolling shooter, as you can obviously not see from the footage that I'm showing, but is one of the worst examples of the genre on this cartridge. First off, you can move in every direction, but you also fire in whatever direction you're facing. This is because enemies can appear and approach you from any direction on the screen, so being able to turn yourself around to fire is important. But because the NES doesn't exactly have the button layout for, say, multi-directional shooting, you actually can't reliably aim at anything. Not that you'd be able to tell when you shoot anyway, because the shots from you and your enemies blend in perfectly with the background. You also have to avoid running into stationary boxes that litter the landscape, and while yes, you can shoot them, good luck actually standing still long enough to aim your shot at them when you have flying enemies constantly trying to fly straight into you. These guys also fly a lot faster than you, so even if you try to dodge or juke them to get out of the way, they'll usually turn well before that and just slam into you anyway. The extreme difficulty in this game prevented me from getting too far into it, and my eyes were not meant for this level of torment, so I didn't spend too long on this one, just long enough to know that most of the design decisions made on it were wrong.
Jupiter Scope.
A single-screen shooter that might just be the most boring game on the whole cartridge, and that is quite an accomplishment. You shoot at falling meteors to destroy them. You'd think with the buildings in the background you'd be penalized for letting the meteors fly past you, but no, you don't even have to shoot at these guys at all if you don't want to. Not that it matters, because the meteors do not fall very often, especially if you're using a turbo button for rapid fire, which just causes the game to stop spawning them altogether. This was the only game I intentionally failed because I was just getting too bored playing this one. Nothing ever changes from stage to stage, and while yes, meteors do fall a bit more frequently in later levels, they come down so quickly that unless you're already near wherever they're falling, you aren't going to reach them in time to shoot. The one positive I'll give this one is that it makes a great sleep aid if you happen to be out of melatonin at the time.
Alfred in the fettuccinis.
Oh man, I've actually been looking forward to this one, guys. You have no idea. You ready? Take a look at this! Yes, that's right, this game just doesn't load up. Well, there is indeed a game there, and folks who are bigger masochists than me have actually found a way to get this particular game working. I didn't bother, as I have no interest in actually going out of my way to do so. This is how it is on the original revision of the cartridge, and that's what I'm looking at. I can at least make fun of the way they decided to name the thing. Well, it's called Alfredo on the list screen. The title screen calls it Alfred N. the Fettic. They couldn't even spell out fettuccine all the way for some reason, and that's just really funny to me. Next game.
Operation Full Moon.
There's a metaphor here for the game showing its entire ass, but I'm bigger than that and thus will avoid making the obvious joke because I just have that much restraint. Aren't I so good at this? This is yet another vertical scrolling shooter, and while it's not quite at the level of Critical Bypass and being hard to look at, it's still a pretty ugly game that's hard on the eyes, but I will give it credit. The color of the background at least changes from level to level. It's a very bog standard shooter with not a lot to recommend it. You just shoot the turrets that appear on the screen before passing in front of them, and most of them won't have a chance to fire against you before you go past them. Of course, you can also be destroyed by running into various walls in your way, but the main issue is that it isn't immediately apparent what is an obstacle and what's meant to just be set dressing, so you'll probably lose a few lives just experimenting on that. Really, the most interesting thing about this game is how it freaks out when you use the turbo buttons. Unlike other shooters on the cartridge that just stop spawning enemies when you have the turbo button pressed down, this game actively starts to destroy itself. And I legitimately had a bit of a fun time seeing just how much the game would dissolve the longer I kept it held down. But that was the only thing about it that was even remotely interesting. Well, we're about a fifth of the way through the games here, and I can already feel my will to continue being tested. Folks like to talk about how glitchy and broken this game is, but honestly, the biggest issue with most of the games is that they're just boring, far too basic and rudimentary to hold your attention for very long. Even if these games were decent, their design basically means that you'd get bored of them in about 10 minutes. So yeah, I can't wait to play more. Retro Quickies, Action 52, Games 6 through 10. Welcome back. You know the drill. We're looking at a bunch of Action 52 games in batches of 5, going through each individual game to give you, the viewer, a better idea of just how bad this cartridge is overall. So let's not waste any time and get right into it.
Silver Sword.
There's not a lot of silver in this game, and I'm convinced that the game is only one level long. Why do I say that? Well, no matter how many enemies I killed or how far I managed to travel, the level never seemed to end, so I can't even say if this game has any sense of progression to it. It's a top-down vertical shooting game that isn't an auto-scroller. Boy, that one's quite a curveball, isn't it? Instead of swinging the sword, you throw it at your enemies, and unfortunately a turbo button doesn't help much here, as you can only have one projectile on the screen at a time, so if you miss your shot, you're going to be waiting a bit before you can shoot again. You do have multiple hits in this game, but how many hits you have is up to you to figure out, since there is no sort of health bar or even an indicator to show that you've taken damage or how close you are to death. The area you're walking through is pretty uninteresting, just a field with a bunch of trees, bushes, and rocks that force you to walk around them occasionally. But it's better than just walking through a black void, I suppose. The enemies, though, are a lot more interesting to look at, mostly because I can't tell what any of them are supposed to be. I'll also give the game credit. This is the first time we've actually seen something resembling enemy behavior rather than just having enemies walk back and forth or just fly across the screen doing nothing. While their movement patterns don't seem to be unique or make any real sense in the grand scheme of things, they're at least acting as a legitimate threat, but they're a little bit too good at that. They move at roughly the same speed that you do, or are faster than you, and they generally don't let you outpace them. They'll continue to follow you as long as they need to, and even when you do manage to pass one by, it's not long before it's replaced. This is probably the most complex game so far, but that's not saying much, and it doesn't really make the game any fun to play when most of the outcomes of any move you make feel completely random, and you don't have a decent way of defending yourself.
Critical Bypass.
Okay, so while none of the games up to this point have looked good, this is the first time I feel I need to warn you all before actually showing you footage. This game is legitimately painful to look at, so if you're someone who is prone to eye strain or headaches, maybe don't watch this one full screen. You ready? Okay, good. Let's go. This is another scrolling shooter, as you can obviously not see from the footage that I'm showing, but is one of the worst examples of the genre on this cartridge. First off, you can move in every direction, but you also fire in whatever direction you're facing. This is because enemies can appear and approach you from any direction on the screen, so being able to turn yourself around to fire is important. But because the NES doesn't exactly have the button layout for, say, multi-directional shooting, you actually can't reliably aim at anything. Not that you'd be able to tell when you shoot anyway, because the shots from you and your enemies blend in perfectly with the background. You also have to avoid running into stationary boxes that litter the landscape, and while yes, you can shoot them, good luck actually standing still long enough to aim your shot at them when you have flying enemies constantly trying to fly straight into you. These guys also fly a lot faster than you, so even if you try to dodge or juke them to get out of the way, they'll usually turn well before that and just slam into you anyway. The extreme difficulty in this game prevented me from getting too far into it, and my eyes were not meant for this level of torment, so I didn't spend too long on this one, just long enough to know that most of the design decisions made on it were wrong.
Jupiter Scope.
A single-screen shooter that might just be the most boring game on the whole cartridge, and that is quite an accomplishment. You shoot at falling meteors to destroy them. You'd think with the buildings in the background you'd be penalized for letting the meteors fly past you, but no, you don't even have to shoot at these guys at all if you don't want to. Not that it matters, because the meteors do not fall very often, especially if you're using a turbo button for rapid fire, which just causes the game to stop spawning them altogether. This was the only game I intentionally failed because I was just getting too bored playing this one. Nothing ever changes from stage to stage, and while yes, meteors do fall a bit more frequently in later levels, they come down so quickly that unless you're already near wherever they're falling, you aren't going to reach them in time to shoot. The one positive I'll give this one is that it makes a great sleep aid if you happen to be out of melatonin at the time.
Alfred in the fettuccinis.
Oh man, I've actually been looking forward to this one, guys. You have no idea. You ready? Take a look at this! Yes, that's right, this game just doesn't load up. Well, there is indeed a game there, and folks who are bigger masochists than me have actually found a way to get this particular game working. I didn't bother, as I have no interest in actually going out of my way to do so. This is how it is on the original revision of the cartridge, and that's what I'm looking at. I can at least make fun of the way they decided to name the thing. Well, it's called Alfredo on the list screen. The title screen calls it Alfred N. the Fettuc. They couldn't even spell out fettuccine all the way for some reason, and that's just really funny to me. Next game.
Operation Full Moon.
There's a metaphor here for the game showing its entire ass, but I'm bigger than that and thus will avoid making the obvious joke because I just have that much restraint. Aren't I so good at this? This is yet another vertical scrolling shooter, and while it's not quite at the level of Critical Bypass and being hard to look at, it's still a pretty ugly game that's hard on the eyes, but I will give it credit. The color of the background at least changes from level to level. It's a very bog standard shooter with not a lot to recommend it. You just shoot the turrets that appear on the screen before passing in front of them, and most of them won't have a chance to fire against you before you go past them. Of course, you can also be destroyed by running into various walls in your way, but the main issue is that it isn't immediately apparent what is an obstacle and what's meant to just be set dressing, so you'll probably lose a few lives just experimenting on that. Really, the most interesting thing about this game is how it freaks out when you use the turbo buttons. Unlike other shooters on the cartridge that just stop spawning enemies when you have the turbo button pressed down, this game actively starts to destroy itself. And I legitimately had a bit of a fun time seeing just how much the game would dissolve the longer I kept it held down. But that was the only thing about it that was even remotely interesting. Well, we're about a fifth of the way through the games here, and I can already feel my will to continue being tested. Folks like to talk about how glitchy and broken this game is, but honestly, the biggest issue with most of the games is that they're just boring, far too basic and rudimentary to hold your attention for very long. Even if these games were decent, their design basically means that you'd get bored of them in about 10 minutes. So yeah, I can't wait to play more. Retro Quickies, Action 52, games 11 through 15. Oh my god, I'm still doing this. Yes, despite my survival instincts kicking in, I'm back to keep doing this as we continue our in-depth look at each of these games in Action 52, though that might be a bit of a stretch considering each of these games are about as deep as a plastic kiddie pool. Speaking of...
Dam Busters!
Top-down shooter where you play as a beaver shooting something or other at other beavers while weaving your way around a winding path to try and get to the end of the level. The game is incredibly boring, but also terrible at the same time. The enemies fire incredibly slow-moving attacks towards you, which makes progressing difficult when you have a spray of enemy bullets in front of you, and actually hitting enemies with your own attacks is difficult, especially when they jerk back and forth. The hitboxes are also really weird in this game, as you can't actually get close to the walls or the edges of a bridge or anything. It's very specific on where you can stand, which can cause some problems where there are built-in dead ends on the path that you're walking on, and you can easily get stuck because the screen can't scroll backwards. Beyond that, the color palette doesn't do the game any favors. The game already looks plain and ugly on its own, but you and the enemies at least contrast against it nicely. But unfortunately, the same can't be said for most shots, which tend to blend into the ground or background pretty heavily, so while enemy shots move really slow, that doesn't matter much when you can't see what you're walking into.
Thrusters!
A pretty generic name for a pretty generic game. It's another scrolling space shooter where you shoot enemy ships to progress. There really isn't anything to say about this one. It plays just like most of the other shooters on the cartridge. It is baseline playable, but that's it. The only interesting thing about this game is the fact that you can't beat the second level because the game freaks out and crashes at the end, which is why I can't really call this game competent.
Haunted Halls of Wentworth.
Another platformer where you wander the halls of a haunted mansion shooting ghosts. I'll give them credit, the player character this time is actually decently rendered, but that's about where the credit ends, as it controls just as poorly as Ooze did, and has an additional glitch where jumping too high can actually kill you for no other reason than you're just too high off the ground. Of course, dealing with the enemies isn't any easier, since they're usually approaching you from the air, out of reach of your weapon, or attacking you from behind unexpectedly. Apart from the enemies, the occasional pit is the only obstacle that you run into. But because of the sudden appearance of enemies, playing this game is actually a lot tougher than it should be, since you usually have to move backwards, turn around, jump, and then fire. And since the controls in this game are anything but smooth, you typically have one, maybe two tries before the ghost is guaranteed to kill you. Couple that with the slow movement speed that makes each level feel like it goes on forever, and you've got another good candidate for a sleep aid.
Chill out.
I wish I could, buddy, I really wish I could. This is a single-screen platformer in the same vein as Illuminator, but rather than flickering lights, you have gaps in the platforms and incredibly slow-moving projectiles. These slow shots are honestly one of the worst parts of the game, considering that they take forever to move across the screen. They don't disappear until they reach the opposite end of the screen, and yes, you do have a health bar so you can afford to take a hit or two, but there's no after-hit invincibility, meaning that there are multiple snowballs being thrown out, and you're going to get hit by every single one of them. This is also the first game where fall damage comes into play, and yes, basically any game where you can fall from any height will have fall damage in it, and the distance you have to travel before it activates is insanely small, hence why those gaps in the platform are actually the most dangerous part. In fact, because of the horrible jumping controls, most of your deaths in this game are going to come from falling off a ledge, which get used to hearing that because it's going to be a common theme going forward.
Sharks.
You're a diver shooting sharks with a harpoon gun. That's about it. But the big issue is that, much like Jupiter Scope, it's incredibly boring because not a lot happens. Most of the time, you're just floating there in the empty blue space, hoping that sharks will spawn in, and that you can actually line up a shot before they disappear off the other side of the screen. At first, you'd assume that you only have about 2/3 of the screen to work with, but that bottom graphic is actually just part of the background. You can swim through it no problem. The only big change up to this game is that if you do manage to stave off boredom enough to get through to level 3, the game introduces jellyfish as a new enemy type, who do make the game more interesting, mostly by making it impossible to progress, since, unlike the sharks, who have to spawn in from the right or left side of the screen, jellyfish will spawn in anywhere, including on top of your character, and you can see how that might be a bit of a problem to survivability. Again, credit where it's due, I can at least tell what everything is supposed to be, a compliment that can't really be given to every game on this cartridge. And that's another 5 games in the bag, through the hoop, done and dusted. But if we keep running into space shooters, I'm gonna warn you, I'm going to have much less to say, because so many of them play the same without any real differential gimmick between them. And no, that's not me saying I won't talk about them, but you know that space shooters make up the bulk of this collection, so yeah, fair warning on that front. Let's keep going, shall we? I'll see you in the next video, please make this madness stop. Retro Quickies, Action 52, Games 16 through 20. This is part 4 of looking at all the games inside the NES version of Action 52, so I'm gonna assume you know the drill by now, so enjoy me floundering to actually come up with anything substantial to say about a bunch of games that are so simple it feels like Pong has more nuance and strategy to it.
Megalonia.
No, that's something else entirely. Another side-scrolling shooter which, apart from some different sprite graphics, is basically a complete clone of GeForce Fighters, down to the fact that if you stay at the bottom of the screen, nothing can hit you at all. Beyond that, the only other interesting bit is that there's a glitch that will stop the boss from spawning if too many enemies spawn near the end of the level, but because the screen stops scrolling, the game just won't load anything new in, leaving you trapped at the end of the level in some unforgiving, damnable purgatory. I think I prefer a hard crash to that.
French Baker.
The following summation of this game is brought to you by Google Translate. I apologize to any French-speaking viewers I happen to have. Bonjour, je joue très mauve. C'est comme chill out. Vous mourrez si vous tombez. Vos ennemis sont le pain et les baguettes. Ils apparaîtront au hasard n'importe où. Vous êtes un voyageur qui lance des rouleaux à pastiller. Le niveau ne change pas d'un niveau à l'autre. Je le répète, c'est très mauve. Je m'excuse pour mon mauve accent français. Prochainement.
Atmos Quake.
Another vertical space shooter, which is basically a clone of Star Evil, just with slightly better level design, in that it doesn't have an obstacle that kills you right at the start of the level, though it's still pretty boring to fly through. And of course, a majority of each side of the screen is closed off with these walls that you can't get near or you die. And there are also a bunch of little purple mines strewn about that you have to avoid, but apart from that, there's not a whole lot to really talk about here. Least of all being the graphics, with dark blue and green patterns used for the first levels, and the purple grain used on the second, making the game look pretty ugly, all things considered. Couple that with the occasional shooting through enemies, and I'd say at least Star Evil had the decency to kill you off quick, rather than drag it out over minutes. Those are minutes you'll never get back.
Meowng.
Listen, we've already seen that the level and mechanic design are not really high priorities for these games, so what do you think is going to happen when they try to do a puzzle game? A genre that, by design, requires a lot of critical thought and careful planning to make sure that it makes sense to the user. You get one of the most nonsensical games on the entire cartridge. You move across a grid of gray squares and try not to step on any invisible traps, but you have no way of knowing where those traps are unless you stand perfectly still and hope that the game will randomly show you where some of the traps are. But if you stand still for too long, you just explode. There's no real way to know when it will show you where those traps are or how long you have before you explode. While the locations of the traps aren't randomized, it certainly feels like the timer is, and sometimes it just doesn't tell you where the traps are. So unless you've played the game enough to memorize where all the traps are, you're gonna explode. I've heard this one compared with Minesweeper before, and no, that's not at all a good comparison, because Minesweeper has a certain level of logic to it. True, you will always reach a point where you basically have to take a shot in the dark and put your faith in Lady Luck, but until that point, you can at least point to the game and say that this is how it works. Meowng does have actual rules, but those rules are obtuse, and not communicated to the player at all, even in the brief description in the game's manual.
Space Dreams.
Horizontal space shooter? Absolutely nothing to say, with the only big things to note about this game being the fact that you're playing as a pacifier firing at safety pins and teddy bears, and you can only shoot one star at a time. Well, that's it for this game. And that's it for another video. Sorry for ending on a wet fart like that, but there's only so much you can say about a game like this. But hey, progress is progress, and I'd like to progress on to something different. But I can't, because I started this and by God, I have to finish it at this point. Retro Quickies. Action 52, games 21 through 25. You know, I could be doing something a lot better with my time. I could be writing a book, I could be sleeping, I could go and play through Elden Ring again. God, that DLC is good. No, I made a commitment, so we're just going to keep going with this. Ready? No? Good. Neither am I.
Streamers.
It's spelled with 2 E's and a Z because it's cool like that. Out of everything that was on this cartridge, I don't think I was expecting to see something taking inspiration from Bionic Commando. You're a clown bunny thing and have to ascend platforms above you by using a grappling hook, I assume that's the streamer, to pull yourself higher while avoiding business folks and big bags of money, and yes, the money, like everything else in this game, is an obstacle to be avoided. Good luck with that, considering that the way this game works, the obstacles are placed at points you cannot avoid them at, meaning that you will inevitably take damage. What's more, due to how horrific the levels are designed, there are plenty of situations where you'll just barely be able to reach the next platform, or even not at all if you decided to climb the wrong side of the screen. And just like so many other games, it's also incredibly ugly in a way that physically hurts to look at. Mostly made of bright colors overlaid with one another. Pairing that with the balloon clip art in the background, it reminds me of the sort of thing I put together in computer art classes when I was in elementary school.
Spread fire.
No, not another shooter. I can't. I just can't. Someone got creative with their mouse clicks and a splatter brush to make the space look halfway spacey in the background for this one, and at that point, I thought the game was giving up even harder than I did since most of the enemy sprites, some of which don't actually have hitboxes, meaning they can't be destroyed, don't even look like anything anymore, meaning that you just have to avoid them as best as you can. And since they aren't limited on where they can travel on the screen, that means that they can easily get down horizontally with you and basically make it so you have no real means of defending yourself.
Bubblegum Rosie.
We jump from one incredibly broken game to another one. Bubblegum Rosie is a platformer, or at least it calls itself that, but the game makes it absolutely unclear whether you can safely jump on enemies or not. Some pits of spikes hurt you while others do not, and due to the horrible jumping controls and the lack of height when you do manage to jump, you aren't going to get very far into this game, because you can't even get past the first few enemies. Apparently, this game turns into a driving game similar to other shooters on the cartridge if you manage to get past the first level, and I'm real sad that I didn't get to see that, but I don't have the patience to brute force my way through this one.
Micro Mike.
It's basically a horizontal shooter where you're going way too fast to actually do anything. It's impossible to make any progress in this game because you can't move up and down fast enough to avoid getting crushed by the walls that appear about 3 seconds into the level. While you can shoot at enemies that appear, chances are good they'll likely kill you if the wall doesn't first. That's all I can really say because I can't make it more than a few seconds into the first level, and even if I could, I doubt that the game magically gets more fun or interesting past that.
Underground.
You drop down into a small underground maze where touching mushrooms kills you. You shoot enemies and can kill them from a good distance away, when you have the room to work with, but unfortunately, because of the way the enemies spawn in, they can easily spawn into tight spaces where you can't easily reach them without getting yourself killed. And while there are workarounds for this, like exploiting how weird the enemy hitboxes are, it's something that happens so often that it basically renders the game unwinnable. Surprisingly, mostly due to the lack of a jump function, this game controls okay, and is one of the few games that has its graphics match its theme, but the main character and enemy sprites still don't do a good job in conveying what they're supposed to be. And I still can't get over the fact that you die from touching these innocuous mushrooms on the ground, just an absolutely bizarre decision. Oh, and look at that, it's only been what feels like a billion years or so, but we're halfway through. Oh god, we're halfway through. And we've already exhausted most of the games that people actually know from this cartridge. That doesn't bode well for the rest of it. And before anybody points out, rightly, that everything on this cartridge is horrible, I would like to remind you that it is possible to hit rock bottom and then dig deeper. Retro Quickies, Action 52, Games 26 through 30. Well, we've broken the halfway point in this marathon. I hope you all are having fun here, because as much as I love laughing at this stuff afterwards, actually playing through these games to get the footage is not all that fun or interesting, because while these games are buggy, glitchy messes, they're really just incredibly boring, and with how many of them are so similar, save for their graphics, it does honestly make each game more difficult to talk about, especially when there's not even a lot to play through. You know, like with this game.
Rocket Jockey.
This game is only 2 levels long and they loop infinitely every time you finish them. It's once again a space shooter where you throw a lasso at cows to catch them while taking out cattle rustlers in space. Apart from you being a cowboy rustling cows and the lack of any substantial feeling of progression, it is yet again a bare-bones horizontal space shooter where you can actually avoid damage really easily. And since this game's difficulty doesn't increase, you're gonna have a real boring time here.
Non-human.
It's another terrible platformer, with the big gimmick in this game being that it's impossible to make any real progress. The starting gap that you have to jump over is actually so wide that it's almost impossible to get over, especially with the terrible jumping controls. Even if you do get past the gap, the enemies on the other side are often in positions where you can't shoot them fast enough before they either shoot you or run into you. Honestly, that's par for the course with the platformers on this cart, but the only reason anyone remembers this game is that half the screen is completely covered in these weird green faces that have no real purpose other than just looking weird.
Cry, baby.
Wow, game, I really don't appreciate you actively insulting me like this. Just because I'm a sensitive soul doesn't give you the right to criticize me. Two easy jokes aside, this is actually one of the more playable games on the cart. It's a single-screen platformer like Chill Out and Illuminator, where you play as a suspiciously large baby crawling on furniture and spraying something at adults to defeat them. The thing about this is that there is actually some logic to how it works, as each enemy has their own movement patterns that determines how far they move and how quickly they move in that pattern, rather than just being the random movements of most other enemies in the other games. Get far enough into the game and there will also be obstacles that you can't use to climb because they'll kill you instantly, stuff like TVs and stoves, which is a clever touch, though apart from what they are, there isn't much to tell you what is immediately dangerous. Of course, the game doesn't look that good, none of these games look very good, and it falls apart when you actually try to move around. You move so much slower than your enemies that actually getting into a good position to attack them without taking damage yourself is very difficult. There's also the weird quirk where if you drop from any sort of height, you die instantly, which you wouldn't think would be an issue in a game like this, but because you can walk off the furniture mid-climb, there is a very real danger of accidentally walking off and falling to your crying death when you're just trying to move from floor to floor. So yeah, this one is more playable, it feels like a game, but it still isn't that fun, which is sad to say because I probably got further into this one than any other game in the collection.
Slashers.
This is supposed to be a beat-em-up, but really it's more like a game of Rock'em Sock'em Robots. You walk forward until an opponent appears in front of you, and when that happens, you can't walk forward, you can only move backwards or up and down. And when you and your opponent get close to each other, you mash your attack button until one of you dies. More often than not, this would probably be you, but as it turns out, this is one of the only games in the cartridge that works properly with a turbo button, in that pressing turbo is basically an automatic win. You attack so fast that your opponent never hits you, except in rare times the game decides to make an enemy invincible and drains all your health. But if you just back up a bit and then re-engage, that seems to fix the issue. There are different types of opponents, but there's no real difference between them. They all seem to go down the same way, and none of them can match the power of the almighty turbo. The game doesn't even feel like it's really trying to have its own personality. When you make a punchy game that has less mechanical depth and nuance than Urban Champions, I honestly think it's worth a bit of an applause.
Crazy Shuffle.
You know, I wear glasses so that I can actually see what's going on, and it really ticks me off when something comes along that reminds me of just how poor my eyesight is. The entire premise of this game is that it's taking place in a microscopic world where your job is to defeat your opponents by shooting them, but 1, it's very difficult to tell where you are in relation to anything else, 2, it's almost impossible to see your shots or your opponents, and 3, they move so quickly and erratically that lining up a shot against them feels like playing the lottery. The background doesn't help either, looking like an incredibly busy coloring book page. It's both simple and yet busy at the same time, which makes keeping track of everything going on around you infinitely harder. I try and I try and I try, but the game is telling me it doesn't want to be played, and I'm more than happy to oblige. Wow, this one actually feels like it was fairly quick to get through. I don't know if that's a good thing though, it pretty much means I'm running out of things to say because a lot of the games are starting to blend together at this point. There are a few more standouts left in the last 20 or so games, but there are going to be even more of these goddamn space shooters. In case anyone cares, I am not having fun anymore. Retro Quickies. Action 52, games 31 through 35. 52 games, all bad, we're in deep, so let's keep going.
Fuzz Power.
You're a hairy troll walking through the woods, battling against razors and hair care tools. It makes no sense, but I'll give them credit for having a diegetic health bar, as you can tell how many times you've been hit by how thick the fur is on your character. Eat your heart out, Isaac Clarke. The background is also not bad, in that I can actually tell what it's supposed to be, even if there are no platforms and only an occasional boulder for you to jump over. But hey, someone actually tried a little bit here. Unfortunately, that's all the nice things I have to say. The only means that you have to defend yourself is this little roll attack, which does seem decently responsive in taking out your foes, but it's useless when most of your enemies can send out these ranged attacks, meant to be wisps of hot air from hair dryers, I think. The problem is, you don't have any real way to dodge them, so you're inevitably going to take a bunch of hits that's going to drain your health and cost you lives. And because there's always a bunch of enemies spawned right near the start, you're basically guaranteed to die only a few seconds into any run of this game. Beyond that, congrats, it's another horrible platformer with terrible jumping,
Shooting gallery.
I don't get the point of this one. It's literally a shooting gallery. You shoot at targets that appear spontaneously on the playing field. They can't hurt you, you don't run out of ammo, and there's no time limit, so you just keep shooting until you get bored, basically meaning that there is no progression at all in this game. So, no point in playing it, I guess. Bye.
Lollipops.
More like lollipoops, am I right? I'm so sorry, please don't leave. Anyway, it's another really bad platformer where you play as a guy armed with a lollipop, destroying candy enemies. The only thing that really makes this game any sort of interesting is, since you have a melee attack that forces you to freeze in place, you can actually fall from a greater height than any other game, since attacking resets the fall distance. So, if you jump up and fall from a great distance, you can just rapidly keep attacking and you'll be totally fine. Beyond that though, you aren't playing anything any different than Ooze or Fuzz Power or Bubblegum Rosie or any other platformer. Different look, same code, basically.
Evil Empire.
Behold, it's another ladder-focused single-screen platformer, only in this one, your character is much smaller. The gameplay is exactly the same as the others. You run around, climbing the ladders, and shooting at enemies that spawn in wherever they want. And as usual, because of the speed at which the enemies move, and the fact that they can spawn opposite each other, it basically means that they can lock themselves in a perfect pattern that makes it impossible for you to get close enough to actually shoot them. Especially since you can't shoot when you're jumping, meaning you have to be level with the enemies, either on a ladder or on a platform. And wouldn't you know, this is one of the few games where the levels actually differ from one another, so you can get into situations where you just can't safely line up a shot. Also, what's so evil about this empire? I don't get it.
Sombreros.
The following review is brought to you by Google Translate, and I am so sorry to anyone in my audience who is fluent in Spanish. And yes, we're doing this bit again. Hola, señores y señoritas, me llamo es Gumbasa. En este juego, eres un hombre con sombrero y arrojas cosas a las aspergados a los coches que intentan atropellarte en un barrio suburbano. El fondo se ve bien, puedo decir lo que es, pero el juego no hace nada para separarse de juegos como Silver Sword. Es muy fácil que es juego, porque al menos puedes mantener presionado el botón y progresar. Pero aparte de eso, es muy aburrido. No lo recomendaría. And there you have it. Once again, we've ripped through 5 of these games and at least the end is in sight. And let me tell you, next time I tackle a multi-video project like this, I think I'll keep it to something that's actually good next time. So look forward to that. Oh, and whatever's left of this series too, I guess. Retro Quickies. Action 52, games 36 through 40. Oh my god, it's the ride that never ends, and I want it to end so badly at this point. Almost there. Okay, let's just do this. What's the next game?
Storm over the desert.
An Operation Desert Storm reference, interesting choice to make. This is also one of the only, 3 games in the cart that has its own unique title screen rather than a generic black text wall. You play as a tank shooting all the other tanks, army men, and occasionally giant Saddams that run past. It's basically one-player combat, but somehow even slower than that game, as it can take forever for enemies to spawn in, and sometimes they just wander off the stage before you can shoot them. Now, a lot of folks seem under the impression that you're invincible in this game, but no, you can actually die, but you just have a weirdly large health pool, something that you really don't need since the enemies never really pose much of a threat. The tanks don't even really fire at you, and the little army men running around are just there to be hard-to-hit fodder. Fodder, that's a good way to describe everything that's on this cart, considering how much of it feels like it's there for maximum padding.
Mash Man.
One thing I have to give a lot of credit to this cart for, there aren't actually a lot of reused assets in most of the games. Many of them use unique sprites. However, that streak ends here and now, as our main character of Mashman is the same guy from Fuzz Power, just wearing clothes and a pair of cool guy shades. I know I usually talk about how basic and terrible the platformers are, but I don't think they get much more basic than this. There aren't any pits, the enemies don't move, and most of the obstacles consist of these big spikes that are just floating in front of you. The big problem, though, is that most of the time, these obstacles are just the right height to make jumping over them very awkward and difficult, coupled with unusually shaped hitboxes. What's more, you can't really be sure if jumping on enemies is actually hurting you or them, because they do disappear, but it seems to decrease your health, which of course you don't have any idea how much you have. You can actually beat this game real easy with a turbo button, just holding it down and hopping up and down the entire time, which is what I did, and trust me, the entire game is like this. The difficulty does not increase, the enemies don't alter or become any more unpredictable, it is basically just a straight line. So while it is a game that you are capable of beating, which is better than most of the other platformers, it is one of the most boring games on the cart. But hey, I got a full 3 paragraphs out of this game, which is not something I can say for
They came.
Whoa, easy there, Action 52. This game is meant for kids, after all. It's a single-screen space shooter where you shoot at enemies, and then the game crashes when you try to move up to the next level. There are actually power-ups, but they don't seem to do anything. What's more, it has the same horrible shooting quirk as Jupiter Scope, where the direction you're moving is the direction you're shooting as well.
Laser League.
Laser is spelled with a Z because it's cool like that, and this whole game is full of spelling and grammar errors. This is another generic space shooter where you scroll from left to right shooting enemies, and it's so poorly programmed that it just flips between level 1 and level 2, but that's it, moving on!
Billy Bob.
You want to know what's cool about this game? The fact that you can't play it for very long. Due to the game's horrible fall damage coding, you will always die when you enter the second room of the first level, because while the obstacles are randomized, the level layout is not, and you'll always have this sheer drop here that will kill you every time. I'm going to give this one a little bit of credit, they were a bit more ambitious here. It almost seems like they were trying to emulate the original Prince of Persia look or feel here, but the problem there is that due to the random nature of the obstacles, compared to the slow and deliberate speed of your movement, even if you could make it past the second screen, you probably wouldn't make it much further because you can't accurately predict when it would be safe to climb or jump over an obstacle. So it's still bad, but I appreciate the attempt at making something just slightly more ambitious than the other platformers. What's that? Ending one of these videos on a slightly positive note? Well, we can't have that. I can't wait until we get to the final 12 games and completely lose my will to live. Happy day. Retro Quickies. Action 52, games 41 through 45. People always tell me that projects like this aren't like sprints, they're more like marathons, but I just don't like running in general, so no matter how fast or slow I'm going, I'm still not having a good time. But I can at least see the finish line, so that's a plus, even if I'm going to collapse as soon as I cross it, and this metaphor is getting stretched to hell and back, so let's move on.
City of Doom.
You're a guy climbing a skyscraper into the stars, throwing bowling balls at weird creatures impeding your progress. You can't safely crawl over the windows in this game because that's where the enemies can appear from, and you sometimes just die when you crawl over a window anyway. Most of the regular enemies aren't that dangerous, you can just hang out near the top of the stage and be perfectly safe, a lot like many of the other shooters, but that doesn't apply to when you run into the boss at the end of the level, who just darts around shooting projectiles and generally being a nuisance. Actually hitting him is a real chore too, since you can only shoot in one direction, which is straight ahead, and the boss likes to stay out on the edges, where you can't reach, or slide down to your level and move side to side. It goes from boring to bullshit real fast.
Bits and Pieces.
It's another horror-themed platformer, but it's pretty close to Mashman in terms of gameplay. But at least the enemies in this game actually move. The principle's the same though, jump over the enemies to get as far as possible into each level. Maybe you can jump on top of your enemies, and maybe you can't, who knows? The hit and hurt boxes in this game is a mystery to me. But much like Mashman, this is another one that is actually pretty easy to beat with turbo button jumping, not that it makes the game any more interesting.
Beeps and Blips.
Another single-screen shooter game where you fire in the same direction you're moving, basically the exact same thing as They Came, even sharing the same music as that game. This one at least doesn't crash after you complete the first level, but it doesn't really get any more interesting, and this is one of the longer games on the cart at a whopping 9 levels. Not that you'd want to see that late into it.
Manchester Beat.
Yet another platformer, this one music-themed. You do have the same melee jump trick in this one, where you can reset your fall height by punching in the air, but the main obstacles in this game are super fast projectiles flying at you from off-screen, usually too fast for you to react to it. If you time it right, you can punch them out of your way, but the timing is really fickle, and they generally come way too fast for you to properly time your attacks. This is another game where actually making some progress is an exercise in futility.
Boss.
You're a lizard man running through a mafia-infested city. This is a side-scrolling platformer, again, man these things are almost as prolific as the space shooters, but you can't actually progress very far because of these bomb-dropping enemies here. No matter how carefully you time it, getting under them without getting hit by the bomb or the resulting explosion is almost impossible. And they're always too high for you to actually hit with your weapon, which is restricted to Mega Man shooting, meaning you can only fire forward. Even if this game wasn't impossible to move in, the slow movement probably would have turned me off from this one. I really don't like slower platformers. But hey, that's it for this collection of games. And this is it, folks. We're going to be ending with the next video. And yes, I'm aware this means we'll be covering 7 games instead of 5, but shut up. I'm not dedicating a whole video to just 2 games from Action 52. That'd be madness. And I'm mad enough as it is. Why wouldn't I be? I'm still talking about Action 52 in the year of our Lord 2024 current year argument. I could be doing a lot better stuff with my time, like talking about the Sega Genesis version of this game. Wait. Retro Quickies, Action 52, games 46 through 52. Oh my god, can you believe it, folks? We're finally there! We finally made it to the end of this! Nothing can express my elation at the prospect of being done so that I can move on to other things, like maybe covering every single Mario Party minigame, or something less heinous than this. Well, anyway, here's the last 7 games in Action 52.
Dead End.
I'd say the title was trying to be clever, but I'm pretty sure Dead End actually doesn't mean anything, so it's losing points right away. It's basically the same as all the other space shooters on the cartridge, only instead of a generic space setting, you're playing as an ant shooting at other ants, spiders, and other multicolored insects of indeterminate origin. Of course, the issue here is that, due to the slow movement and firing rate of your avatar, it's impossible to keep up with the spawn rate of the enemies, who will very easily make it all the way down to the bottom of the playfield, where you have no recourse or ability to fight back. Sometimes they do make their way back up, but more often than not, they just stay there, forever, waiting. It's only a matter of time.
Hambo's Adventures.
Yet another single-screen platformer, though unlike every other one on the cart, where you progress by defeating a certain number of enemies, this one has you hopping over obstacles to reach the end goal. It might actually be at least a little bit more interesting, but due to the horrible jumping controls, wonky hitboxes, and random enemy movement and placement, even jumping over the most basic enemy and making it to the exit of a level is shockingly difficult. Well, okay, it's Action 52, so it's not that shocking.
Time Warp Tickers.
I don't even know what I'm looking at here. You're a pair of fingers locked in what looks like a low-rent clone of Wacky Land from Looney Tunes, flicking at worms, rectangles, and eyeballs to try and reach the end of the stage. Unlike other platformers like this on the cart, you only have 1 hit point, so getting killed is very easy, especially since enemies love to fly at you from both sides of the screen, and having to turn around to attack with that dinky little flick of yours is a lot harder than it seems.
Jigsaw.
Oh boy, another one of my favorite games from the collection. For the exact same reason as Alfred and the Fettuccine, it doesn't actually start up. For any other cartridge, I'd probably be disappointed by this, but do you really think that a simple jigsaw puzzle game, which I assume is what this would be any more interesting than anything else in this collection? Probably not, and even when it's well programmed, if I wanted to put together a jigsaw puzzle, I'd go to my local library and pick up a jigsaw puzzle. I wouldn't boot up a game to play this. Or I'd go and play Banjo-Kazooie, that game had plenty of jigsaws.
Ninja Assault.
Another semi-pseudo sort of beat-em-up like slashers, except it's a flat 2D plane, and you can't depend on the almighty turbo button this time around. There's a bit more range of movement with this one, in that the game doesn't force you to stop in your tracks when you engage in fights with the enemy, but it's still a one-on-one affair where you hammer on the attack button and hopefully hit the enemy before they hit you. Combat in this one is a lot slower since you and the enemy are constantly flying backwards after getting hit, rather than mashing together like a pair of action figures being wielded by a sugar-high 8-year-old. But I will say I rather like the crunchy sound effect whenever one of you gets hit. It's not exactly satisfying, but hey, it's something. And it gives me a chance to pad out this section of the video. Give me your ad dollars.
Robbie and the Robots.
Oh man, what an underwhelming penultimate experience. It's basically another clone of Ooze, but with even less level design. You can just run through the first level without stopping at all, and even when pits are introduced in the second stage, so long as you're quick to jump over them, like with the turbo button jump glitch, the difficulty doesn't really get too much higher. Hell, it is one of the only platformers where you move at a decent pace too. So it's a game with a nugget of something fun in there, but of course, it was thrown together at the same time as everything else on the cartridge, so it's mostly just boring because of that. Functional, but I'm not going to applaud a game for just reaching the bare minimum.
Cheetah Man.
And here we are, folks, the final game, 52 out of 52, the denouement to this entire horrific experience, and also the one that Active Enterprises was obviously banking on to make them some real big cash. They wanted this to be their big toyetic breakthrough, their TMNT, their Street Sharks, their My Little Pony, basically. Unfortunately for them, it would be none of those things. Hell, it wouldn't even be a Bucky O'Hare, or a Skeleton Warriors, or a Mummies Alive, or a Biker Mice from Mars, or a Mighty Ducks the Animated Series. Man, there were a lot of these sorts of series, weren't there? Anyway, this is one of the only games that gets any sort of cutscene or story explanation, with a guy called the Action Game Master getting isekai'd into his Action 52 cartridge, where the Cheetah Men for some reason agree to fight for him and defend him. I mean, it's nice to know that there is an actual story here as opposed to every other game, which barely gets anything. Even the manual basically just has a one-sentence blurb about what's actually happening in each game, but the whole thing about the Action Game Master doesn't come back at all at any point in the game. But with all this extra work and ambition behind it, you'd expect this to be the top of the bottom, the cream of the crap, right? At the very least, it has to be more interesting than the other games that came before it, yeah? No, it's just as bad. Its big gimmick is that every 2 levels, you switch to a different Cheetah Man with a different weapon. And while it does sound like that could be interesting, 2 of them are functionally the same, and the last one, who uses a crossbow, ironically is harder to use because hitting anything with his tiny shot is really finicky. The first stage is also isometric in nature, but the rest of the game plays out as a basic side-scroller, and this is also probably the game that has the most egregious reuse of assets in the whole package. While I can't tell if the background or stage elements are reused, as it could just be tiling used from other stages for all I know, most of the enemies and obstacles that you run into are sprites from other games, like the flying pies and female enemy model from Slasher. It's kind of weird considering, again, this was supposed to be their big breakthrough title, so much so that a sequel was in development before the company went belly up, and the single run of produced cartridges for said unreleased sequel is now one of the rarest, most expensive cartridges on the console. The game also has a boss fight, but at this point in recording it, I just couldn't push through to actually reach it, and it's just as jank as anything else in the cartridge. And there you have it, every single game in Action 52, each one covered individually. This was a very bad idea, mostly because there's only so much that I can talk about with games as simple as this. I do like the idea of covering games within games like this, but damn, I'll need something more interesting for this format in the future. For now though, I think I know exactly how to sum up the entire experience. You ready? Because here it comes. It's bad.